So now that you're joining the OpenSSF, I mean, and you talked about how supply chain security was one of the interesting areas that you've been focusing on. Give me your perspective on where we are as an open source ecosystem when it comes to open source software supply chain security, and what do you think are the biggest things we need to be trying to do, and what do you think holds the most promise?
Yeah, I think we're doing relatively well as an open source community, especially at least when you compare it to closed source software. And I think this is something that a lot of people we you sometimes have to educate them on it because like with the XZ vulnerability that came in and that got talked about a lot. It's like, oh my gosh, this crazy thing happened. This like guy, like he came in and just did all this stuff. But the other side of that story is it also got caught because of the
Mm-hmm.
open source community. And if that had happened at a closed source company, like, is there actually enough review processes in place at that company to actually catch that before it hits production?
Like SolarWinds as an
Right.
example.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Um, and so, I think we're doing pretty well, mostly just because of the number of eyes that exist in this space. Although obviously things still can get through. I think the bigger things are, S bombs are great, and they're good in some ecosystems like the Go ecosystem or npm or Python, um, where there's like defined metadata around packages, and you can look these things up, and it's pretty standardized. It isn't still as great in other ecosystems that are older, like C, like I mentioned earlier. You struggle sometimes to define like what is this blob of of Z code, because it's not always packaged in some sort of format, and you can't always like detect that. And people can kind of just link in things from wherever on the system, and bring it in. And so I think there still is some work to be done on some of those lower level technologies. Obviously, people are moving from C to Rust, and there's a lot of and Rust is a much better ecosystem from an package management perspective as well. So stuff like that will help. And then the other thing as well is, that's kind of the ingest side to your application. But then also, like, how do you release your application? So do you do provenance, attestations, signing, stuff like that, so people know that they're actually downloading the right binaries? Like, who has access to push to your actual release repositories? Like, do you have that lockdown? Do you have things signed? Can people validate certain things? That's in place in larger repositories, like app repositories. You have, the trust comes from the signatures there, but not every ecosystem has implemented stuff like that. I think we still have work to do on those fronts.
And that's, yeah, and that's, I mean, you're coming right to the crux of something that I've been trying to understand better and try to think through how we might best continue to move forward, in the sense that there are, we keep adding more requirements to open source projects, from a security standpoint, from an SBOM standpoint, from yeah, improved code coverage for testing, doing the signing, doing two-factor authentication. And some communities and some community leaders are balking at that, right? They're like, this is too much work. I was overloaded to begin with, and now you're putting all these additional requirements on me. So how do we stratify whatever security is required, so that those that just want to be and remain hobbyists, here's my code, use it if you want to, go have fun. There's a place for that, right? And that makes sense too. But if right now we treat all open source identically, when you're bringing things into a corporate, or again, where software supply chain security and critical infrastructure is really important, you have to have some kind of delimiter, or do you? I mean, this is what I've been
Well,
trying to come through. And how are we going to change this going forward, so that all participants get what they want out of the ecosystem? But for those that have mission critical type of activities, we know that the software we're using is indeed, to a level of security that we can trust.
yeah, I think a lot of it actually comes down to UX, user experience, as well. I think at GitHub and npm provenance, whatever you think of GitHub and Microsoft, they've made that pretty simple. If you have a GitHub project, to make sure that your npm package was built by your GitHub Actions pipeline, and that it flew over to npm, and that there's this chain now, and you can build a signed thing. Um, that's easy even for a hobbyist to adopt and to start doing. And so I think a lot of it comes down to kind of large platforms like that people are using, like GitHub, implementing certain things, ecosystems, implementing and making things easier, individual tools, making that UX easier to understand, easier to pick up, and easier to adopt. And I think that will help along the way. That's one of the things that we tried to focus on with Zarf, is trying to think about the UX. We have a slightly different reason for it in that a lot of the folks that work in air gapped environments maybe aren't the most technically trained or whatnot, so there has to be some sort of handholding there. But we found that it does help in other cases as well, where if you focus on UX and you try to like explain to the user what's going on, you make it very easy for them, just a few clicks to do something, or just even if it's on the CLI, it makes it easier for them to adopt it and easier to start using it. And I think that's something that should be done more in various security products as we're building this stuff out. We've worked a lot with our UX team within Defense Unicorns. Madeline's like the head of our UX team, and she came from the web dev side, but did a big deep dive on CLI design and created like a lot of the design docs that we use for Zarf, which is kind of like new and novel in that space, in the UX space.
Mhm.
Like nobody
Mhm.
looks at CLI apps and how they work. And I think that if you can improve that for those kinds of applications, then it'll make it easier for people to use them and adopt them, and then it'll reduce that barrier to entry.
I'm also curious, like again, back to your personal experience in open source, like with defense unicorns, you use the word product. So I assume that you do have some productization work on top of the projects that you have.
Yep.
Is that a correct assumption?
Yes.
Since those are two very different kinds of work, like you personally, do you work 100% upstream and on open source projects, or is your time divided between product and project?
I would say it's right now currently divided. When I was on Zarf, it was pretty much entirely dedicated to Zarf, and that project. But we are, as I kind of alluded to before, productizing a lot of these projects under the Unicorn Delivery Service sort of moniker, which is a bunch of different system components. It's all open source, but it's the parts of things that we're holding for ourselves to really be able to move faster, and get things done for our customers. Other people can use it, but the intent isn't so much to build a community around those pieces as it is the Zarf covering the parts that we feel more people can take advantage of. Um, there are things though that flow from product to Zarf. So Zarf is obviously a CLI tool, but it also is an SDK. And so there's a library inside of Zarf that allows you to interact with it as an SDK. And actually, its SDK is the core of UDS CLI, which is the CLI interface to UDS. And so there's obviously a lot of like cross product project interaction there, where there may be a feature that we want to do something with, and then kind of bring that back and forth. One of the ones that actually is a decent example, I think, that we experimented with was Helm overrides. So a lot of Zarf is based around Helm and Helm charts, and that's kind of how it manages the lifecycle of Kubernetes objects. But there was this need from our own delivery people to take some of the packages that we were building and then modify them in some way for a given customer's environment. A lot of those things that they wanted to modify were just Helm values. And so we worked to add to the Zarf SDK this concept of Helm overrides. And we didn't initially expose that on the CLI at first, but we wanted to experiment with it in the SDKs for just to see how this worked. And so we started ingesting that into UDS CLI and having our delivery folks play with it. They wound up liking it, and so we then eventually like put that into the Zarf schema, and it's now a feature in Zarf. So those two pieces working together, like when it benefits the product, but sometimes you can also experiment with the product first without having to like burden the community with something crazy, and then actually get it out into the project fully.